Okay, my friend. Today's Daf Yomi is Nedarim Daf Zayin, Nedarim 7, and we've been in the middle of all the Bayis Rav Papa. Rav Papa's had these questions about whether or not a yad is effective in different areas. A yad is a statement where you don't fully formulate what we think your intentions were, and so therefore you didn't speak it out, but we think we know what you mean based upon what you said, whether or not what you said is therefore binding. So the Gemara has a question, and we assume it's Rav Papa's question, because we just asked the question about whether or not there's a yad for payah, whether that amount of the field is given over as the corner of the field to the poor or not, whether a yad works in that sense. Now the Gemara has a question, yesh yad l'tzedakah or ein yad l'tzedakah, whether or not, if you don't fully formulate that you're going to give this gift as charity, but we think you, based on what you said, we think you want to give it to charity, whether or not it's binding. So the Gemara asks the question first, what's this scenario? If you say this coin is for charity and this also, well, that's actually charity. So there's no question there. So it must be able to go into Amar Hadain Amar Nami Mai. So let's say he says this, but he doesn't say this also. He says this is for charity and this. Do we say Hadain Nami Tzedakah? Or do we say this he's saying is also charity? Oh, Dilma, or are we saying, or maybe also what we're saying is my vahadin l'nafkusa ba'almakama, or maybe he's just separating it. The dibura hu duo aske, and he just didn't complete his speech. So what is he saying? Is he saying what is hadin, meaning to say that? Are we saying that he means for charity, or maybe he means he's separating it completely, and he just didn't finish what he was saying? Do we say miyamrina kimin de iskash l'karbanos? We say that since charity is comparable to the laws of sacrifices, because it says the word b'ficha by charity in the verse, and also in that verse is also a reference to sacrifices, because it says the word motzas fasecha tishmor hasisa kasher nadar, like you took a vow, which is a reference to sacrifice. The davar shertibarta b'ficha, and a vow that you took with your mouth as a reference to charity. Zu tzedakah, that's charity. Ma karbanos yesh la'yad, just like by a carbon, we're going to say that the yad works. So too, with respect to tzedakah, we're going to say that the yad is effective. Av tzedakah yesh la'yad. Udilma about the acher huda is kish, or maybe we're going to say that it's comparable for the prohibition of only bal ta'acher. Now, in what sense is tzedakah compared to a carbon in the verse? Only to say that there's a prohibition in both of Baal Ta'achar. You're not allowed to delay the payment of the vow. So just like you can't make the delay in the payment of an obligation to bring a sacrifice, so too you can't make a delay in the payment in the vow to give charity. Mar doesn't ask that question, but yet it now goes on to another ibaye. The Gemara is asking, and one assumption, one way to read this Gemara is, even if you say that there is yad for tzedakah, that an incomplete statement about a gift to give to charity is considered to be binding, do we say yesh yad lahafker or dilma ein yad lahafker? Is there these types of statements with respect to hefker? Or maybe there are not these statements with respect to hefker, meaning to say, if a person makes their objects ownerless, but he does it through an incomplete statement, is it going to be applicable? So the Gemara says, do we say hefker hainu tzedakah? But so the Gemara says that hefker, that's charity. That when you make something, presumably when you make something ownerless, you're doing it so that all the poor people can take it. So what's the difference between this question and the question by charity? So Gemara says, imtim salomar kamar. It's an imtim salomar question, meaning to say, if you want to say, imtim salomar, if you want to say, yesh yad tzedakah, if you want to say that there is a yad for tzedakah, that yados work by charity, that meaning to say that they're effective. The ain hekesh l'mechza, because when the verse compares charity to sacrifice, it's not just comparing it for the prohibition of al ta'achar, it's also comparing it for the prohibition of yados, that yados take effect. So do we say imtim somer yeshal tzedakah dein hekesh l'mechza hefker nami amrinan hainu tzedakah, and so therefore we would say that hefker is also charity, and so therefore by hefker it's also yad takes effect. Oh, doma shani tzedakah, or maybe there's a fundamental difference between charity and hefker. Tzedakah or chazia o aniyim, because if you make something, if you give something to charity, it's only appropriate for poor people. Of hefker, but when it comes to hefker, it applies bein aniyim, bein ashir. When it comes to hefker, it applies both for poor and for wealthy, and so therefore maybe yados are not affected by hefker. So now we have one more question. The Gemara again leaves all these questions unanswered. And the Gemara has one more question. The Gemara's question is, Yesh Yad. It says the Gemara, by Ravina asked this question, Yesh Yad al-Beis HaKisei Olo. Do we say that yados apply to a Beis HaKisei or not? So what's a Beis HaKisei? A Beis HaKisei is a euphemism for a toilet. It's literally, it's the house of the room with the throne. The throne means here the toilet. And so the Gemara is asking, we know that once you have a room with a toilet in it, then you're not allowed to recite Shema or pray or study Torah in that room. So the question here is, if you haven't used that room yet as a toilet, you just designated, you built it. So what's going to be the question there? And what's going to be the situation there? So if you have designated a room, but only through this as a toilet, but only through this incomplete statement, is it going to be considered a toilet so that you can study Torah in it or not? If you want to say that what's the scenario? If you say that this toilet, that this room is for a toilet, and this also, well, that's literally the toilet. So obviously, there's nothing to talk about there. So I would base a kisanami. Ella could go into must be. We're talking about a scenario. The Amar v'hadain. So this room is for a toilet, and this. V'lo Amar nami. You don't say in this too. So my hadin. What does it mean when he says this? My hadin the Amar. Maybe he's saying v'hadin nami base a kisei. This other room is also a toilet. Maybe that's what he's saying. Udoma, or perhaps what's he saying? Udoma my v'hadin. V'tashmisha ba'alma kamer. He's saying this room is a toilet, and this we can use in general. So the Gemara first interrupts Ravina's question and says, Miklal, the pshita leilo Ravina, the yesh zimun lebeis hakisei. It's obvious to Ravina that just by preparing something, but without actually using it, we're going to say that there's zimun lebeis hakisei, that just by saying something, it's considered to be prepared, and then even though you haven't used it yet as a toilet, the whole room is considered to be a toilet, and so therefore you can't study there, even if you just say it. Gemara says, "Vami baile Ravina," but why does Ravina take this question as obvious, or elsewhere Ravina has the question? Because Ravina has this question in Brachos and in Shabbos. Ravina says, "Is minu beis hakisei mahu? Is minu beis hamerchatz mahu?" If you prepared a room to be used as a toilet or as a bathhouse, but you haven't actually used it, are you allowed to study Torah in it? Do we say zimun moil? Oh, ain't zimun moil. Do we say that this preparation is going to be considered effective in the sense that now it's considered a toilet even before you used it? Or do we say it's not effective? So there, Ravina asks the question. So how come here he assumes that it's effective in advance? So the Gemara says, Ravina chada miko chada kamibayale. Ravina is asking one on top of the other. This is another part of the language of Nedarim, which is unusual. Chada miko chada. That's another phrase that's appropriate for Nedarim, that it applies to this tractate. Do we say Zimamo or ain't Zimamo and Imtim Talomer? So he's saying that's what he's asking. Is Zimun effective or is Zimun not effective by a bathroom or a toilet? And Imtim Talomer Yesh Zimun. And if you want to say that bathroom that Zimun is effective by a toilet, are we saying Yesh Yad or Ein Yad? If you say Zimun is effective just by preparing it, we say there Yados work in those circumstances or not. And then the Gemara's answer to this question is Tibayoe. Tibayoe, Tosfos tells us what these words Tibayoe mean. Pirush Kamo Teku, Lashon Nedarim Meshuna. He says that the words Tibayoe are the equivalent of the words that we have in the rest of Shas, which say Teku, which means that we leave a question unresolved. So in Nedarim, we don't say Teku. In Nedarim, we say Tibayoe. And Tosfos says, Lashon Nedarim Meshuna. Nedarim is one of the tractates that have unusual language. So therefore, it's clear. It was probably, that's why some say it was written in a different yeshiva because they use different language in the Nedarim. So that therefore it's called Tibayoe. So now the Gemara asks the question, if we're going back to our Mishnah, so since it says Tibayoe Teku, usually when it comes to Teku, we adopt a stringent approach and we'd have to be stringent upon ourselves. But some say no, that's only in a case of whether or not something is permitted or prohibited. But here it comes to whether or not you owe money, so maybe it's not a stringent approach. And that's the question of how do we deal with the Tibayoe in this case. So now our Mishnah had said, Menuda Anilacha, and if a person had said, I am Menuda from you, then Rabbi Akiva was Chochech Pazer La'achmir. Rabbi Akiva was strict in a case where you use as in the formula of an oath, Menuda Anilacha, Rabbi Akiva was strict. Ran says, what does Chochech mean? Ka'adam shemesupak b'davar, u'mischachech ba'atzmah mipnei she'eino yachol varro. Like a person who is unclear, meaning to say that, or else alternatively it comes from the word palate, like chech. That it seems to him, it tastes like it's strict. So Amar Abaye says, in Moder Rabbi Akiva in Malchus, Rabbi Akiva would admit that with respect to ashes, that the person does not go ashes. And this circumstance where he says, Menuda anilacha, that I'm excommunicated from you, but that's not, Rabbi Akiva will not say that if you then benefit from that person, that it's considered a violation of the oath and that you would get lashes. To him came, because if this would be the case, Nisnei Rabbi Akiva Machmir, we would just say the language Rabbi Akiva is strict. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva is strict, but only rabbinically, not biblically, you wouldn't get lashes. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Papa, Benedina Minach, Kui Alma, and in a case where he uses the words Nedina Minach, where he says, I am excommunicated, Shani Ocha, that's what Ran says. Where he says, I'm menuda from you, that I will not eat from you. Then this is an expression of everybody saying that he's prohibited to eat from him if he uses this language. Because Nedina is an expression of an oath. But Misham Tanaminach, but if he uses the word Misham Mitna Minach, which is an expression of Neder, of Nidoy, of an excommunication, then everybody would say it's permitted. Then even if he says that I will not eat from you, then there's no prohibition, because this is not an expression of a vow, but it's an expression of an excommunication. And so therefore, that's what Rav Papa says. But my pligi, where is there a dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, or on the top of Zion on the base? Only where he uses an expression of b'menuda anilach, that where he says b'menuda anilach, where that's where there's a dispute. Rabbi Akiva's other position, that menuda is lishna diniduyahu, that this is an expression of just being distant. And so therefore it's an expression of a vow, and so therefore it's an expression that he's going to be prohibited. Rabbanan Savri Lishnam Deshamtana, whereas the Rabbanan of the position it's a language of excommunication, and so therefore he's permitted, because it's not a vow, he's just saying I'm excommunicating myself from you. and so therefore it's not a vow, and so therefore he's allowed to have benefit from that person. So that's the dispute. Upligi de Rav Chisda, and the Gemara brings that even though this is how Rav Papa formulates this dispute amongst the Tanaim, he's actually in dispute with Rav Chisda, because Dahu Gavra, the Amar Mishamtana ben Nachse, there was once a man who said, I am excommunicated from his possessions, the Brei de Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, from the son of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, and also Kamei de Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda said, Leis techash laha, Leis techash laha de Rabbi Akiva. He says, nobody is concerned about the position of Rabbi Akiva that's a language of excommunication. But we see that Rav Chisda says that that's where there's a dispute, even by Meshamtana, and even where he uses this expression of nidoy, of menuda, of excommunicated, Rabbi Akiva would be strict and say it's prohibited. But he says we're not strict for that. So therefore, Rav Chisda allowed the person to have benefit under those circumstances. So we see from here, Kasavar b'mishamtana pligi. Rav Chisda's other position that the Chacham and Rabbi Akiva are arguing even about this case of an excommunication. Amar Rabbi Ilah, Amar Rav, the deal b'fanav, if a person excommunicated somebody else in his presence, meaning Reuven excommunicated Shimon, and Shimon was right in front of him, in matirin lo ala b'fanav. Then, when Reuven releases Shimon from his excommunication, he has to do this in his presence. If he excommunicates him not in his presence, then he can release from the excommunication even when he's not in his presence. So, what's the reason? The Rad tells us that the reason is the Kivan de Befanav Nido, since he excommunicated in front of him, Olam Niduye, the nidoy, the excommunication is so strong. He can only remove it in his presence. It's like something that was done in front of 10. You need another 10 to remove it. The Ran says, I don't like that answer, even though the Ran cites that first. He says, Lo nihira, I don't like it. The timer is the milsa mishum chashada. What's the reason if you excommunicate somebody in front of them that you need to release them in front of them? It's a concern, a chashad, that we're concerned. The imatirin lo shelo b'fanav ba'amim sheyatiru v'amenuda lo yada shelo yenigo bon nidoy yavo l'chashada. Because if you release him and he's not with you, then sometimes you'll release him and the person who's excommunicated will not realize. And then when you don't act with him as though he's in excommunicate, then people are going to be concerned that you're violating the laws of Menuda. So that's the Ran's concern. Anyway, so back to the Gemara. So Amar Rabbi Eli, Amar Rav, Nidav b'fanav ematirno al b'fanav. Yes, communicate the person in his presence. You can only release him in his presence. Nidav shalo b'fanav. But if you excommunicate him and he's not in his presence, meaning say you excommunicate him when he's not there, matirno bein b'fanav bein shalo b'fanav. You release him both in his presence and not in his presence. Amar Rav Chanin, Amar Rav Hashomea Askaras Hashem epi chavero. So somebody hears the name of God mentioned in his presence, then you're required to excommunicate him. Meaning to say somebody misuses the name of God, you're required to excommunicate him. Because this is based upon the verse in the beginning of Tamura, the Ran tells us, down on Alf, we say that you're prohibited to use God's name in vain, based upon the verse, as Hashem o kechatira, you need to fear God, and therefore, if you don't excommunicate him, you're going to be disrespecting the name of God. And if you have the ability to excommunicate him and you don't, he himself will be excommunicated. Rad says it doesn't mean that he's automatically excommunicated, but rather he's worthy to be excommunicated, because the person who said the name of God, he obviously needs to be excommunicated. He's not automatically excommunicated. So you can't be, it's not worse than the person who actually said it. As we say, Shekol Makam Shaskar Hashem Mitsuya, wherever the name of God is misused, Sham Anius Mitsuya. There, poverty is found. Va'anius Kamisa, and poverty is like death. As it states, Kimesu Ko Anashim. Because it says about Moshe Rabbeinu that Hashem told him come back to Egypt because all the people who were seeking your death have now died. So what's the reason why somebody who is poor is considered like they're dead? There are arba chashuvim kames, and one of the people who's considered like they're dead even when they're alive is poor. And the reason is because somebody who's poor is unable to do things. You're crushed in your abilities and your dreams. So in that sense, it's like you're dead. And what's the proof from that says Kimesu Ko Anashim? That they didn't actually die, because we say that this is a reference to Dasan and Aviram who were the ones who were trying to kill Moshe. So therefore, but we know that they were alive when it comes to the incident with Korach. And so therefore, it must be that they were poor. The Ran asks the question, maybe they were Mitzurai, maybe they were lepers. So the Ran says we can't say that because it says, B'Karev Kol Yisrael, and we can't say that they were healed in Matan Torah because the Ran discusses how do we know that. But who are the four Arba Chashuvim Kames? And so this is very, very painful Gemara. One time I was learning this with somebody, and he said he fit into two of those categories. Or actually he fit into three of those categories. So this is something that's incredibly painful. We have to be very sensitive. And I think the point of it is not to say that the four people are considered like they're dead, but rather we have to be extra sensitive to people because they feel like they're missing something in their life. What are the four? The four are basically Ani, a person who's poor, Suma, a person who's blind, Mitzora, a person who's Tsaras, but here I think it refers to really somebody who's very, very sick and is ostracized from the community, Misha Elo Banim, and somebody who is without children. So this is the concept, is that this person is sensitive to things that they're missing in their life, and therefore we have to be exceedingly sensitive around such a person. It's prohibited. There's a special prohibition to talk bad about somebody who is dead, and so therefore, or to be low garash, or to be haughty, and so therefore we have to be exceedingly sensitive and careful about in these categories. So Vitanya, and we're going back to the Brisa. The Brisa says, wherever the Chachamim put their eyes on somebody, oh miso only, they get deaf or poor. And so we see from here that somebody who is not, that it says in the Brisa that somebody who the rabbis are upset with, they either get death or poverty. It's from the fact that it compares poverty to death, we see that death is considered, that poverty is considered like death. He says, Rabbi Abba says, I was standing in front of Rav Huna and I heard this woman who used God's name in vain. Shamta Visharla Alter excommunicated her, then immediately released her from her excommunication be'apa in her presence. Shema Mina Tlas, we learn from here three things. Shema Mina Hashem Yaskar Hashem Pichavero, somebody who hears God's name mentioned by his friend. You need to excommunicate him. Shema Mina Nidal B'fanav, Imatirah B'fanav. That if you excommunicate him in front of you, you need to release him in front of you. Shema Mina. Now you don't need to wait between nidoy and afar. Just like if you reject a vow, if you revoke a vow, you could do it immediately. So too, when it comes to excommunication, you could excommunicate the person and then immediately release the excommunicate. Torah scholar is able to place himself in excommunication and then release himself from the excommunication. And the Ran here cites powerful teaching of the Rashba. He says this is where he's really, where he places himself in excommunication, how can he immediately release himself? So he says, we're referring to a story where he is not himself really supposed to be excommunicated. How so? Like the case of Mar Zutra, the Midas Chasidus Ba'alma, Mishumikar de Beirav, Ave Mishamis Navshe. That he's referring to the Gemara where Mar Zutra, he had to place his student in excommunication. So he immediately placed himself in excommunication as well. And then when he came home, before he was with his family, he released himself from the excommunication. So that's why he's able to do it. So that's why so that's the case. And that's what the Gemara says here. That so Amar Gidam Rav Tamachacham Menudo Atzmo made for Atzmo. So the Gemara says Pshita, it's obvious. No, Ma'al he might have thought that he can't release himself. Why? Ein chashiv matir atzmon beis asurin. It's like we have the case where the Gemara in Brachos, where a Torah scholar needed another Torah scholar to heal him. Why couldn't he heal himself? Because we have a principle that a person who's in prison is not able to release himself from prison. So even the greatest Torah scholar needs somebody else to release him, to pray for him. So too, you might have thought he needs somebody else to release him from excommunication. Kamash one that we don't say that. So the Gemara says, "Hey chidami, what are we talking about? A Torah scholar can release himself from the excommunication." This is the case I just mentioned with Mar Zutra Chasida, that Kimechayev Bar Beirav, when one of his students required Shamta, when he required excommunication, Mishamet Navshe Beresha, that first he excommunicated himself. And he did this. Why did he excommunicate himself? So the Rosh says because he did it out of honor for Torah, because it was so difficult for him to excommunicate a Torah scholar. Another answer is he excommunicated himself so they wouldn't forget to release the student from excommunication. Or maybe another concern is that the Ri says that maybe he was worried he's going to be punished because he excommunicates a Torah scholar. And another explanation is, this is brought down by the Meiri, is that he wanted to joining in the pain of the Torah scholar, of the student who is being excommunication. And so he excommunicated himself. Then he excommunicated the and then he excommunicated himself. And then he excommunicated the Torah scholar. But then when he went home, he released himself, and then he released the Torah scholar. And so therefore, so that he's able to be with his family. We see from here that somebody who is excommunicated, he's not allowed to be with their family. But what about the fact that there's a question elsewhere, that the question whether or not somebody who's excommunicated is allowed to be with their wife? So there we say with the wife, it's exception, because ishtuk gufo. So that's what the Ran says, when it comes to your wife, even though you're excommunicated, you're allowed to be with her, but that's the exception, but not with the rest of the family. Okay, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address them.